Hey guys, it's Barbie with Two Friends in the Bible. Excuse my hot mess today. I've been running around, had to wash my car, all that good stuff, but I really wanted to get this video out today. So here I am, and I'm burning up because it's hot and I was washing my car. And so I had to put a nice, beautiful snow scene behind me to cool me off. Maybe that'll help y'all too if you live in a hot area like we do. I'm in Georgia. But today we're going to be doing something really different than we normally do. And y'all, this is a wild ride. We are actually going to be talking about the Alamo cult. Well, it's the Alamo Christian Ministry cult. So if you've ever heard of it, hopefully I can give you some extra information, but if you haven't heard of it, yeah, it's going to take you for a wild ride. And honestly, I am going to probably turn this into 2, maybe even 3 videos because it is 18 pages typed. It's quite long, and it's taken me 3 days to do all the research on it. And why are we doing a cult? Well, we are doing a cult because when we were doing our series on the seals and the Olivet Discourse, comparing those two, and they were the same, one of the first things I noticed was, that Jesus clearly tells us, do not be deceived. And the other thing that he tells us in the Olivet Discourse is, watch out for false messiahs, false prophets, false teachers, all of that. So I'm from my background is in the legal field, working with domestic violence survivors, working in law offices, that type of thing. And so true crime has always been interesting to me. And so I was watching one of the people on YouTube that I like that does true crime, and she was doing one on this particular cult, and for weeks now it has just been tugging at my heart that we needed to do something on a cult. And we just want to make sure that people understand, especially non-Christians, what a cult is, because they brainwash you and they always use religion. And so we want to make sure that people understand. And the best way that you cannot be fooled is by staying in your Bible, staying in the Word, listening to teachings, learning about stuff, being in prayer. That is the best way. And with my years in domestic violence, because I worked in domestic violence shelters in addition to working in the law firms for about 9 years. And so, we had to do 80 hours continuing education every year. And man, plus just working with the survivors, I've learned a lot. And through that and how people end up in a domestic situation is very similar to how they end up in a cult. It starts off very small. First, they want to know, the person wants to know where you are all the time. Then eventually they want to start taking your money from you. So you don't have an income, or if you have an income, they're taking it from you. So you have no way to save money that you can never escape. Then they want to isolate you from your friends and your family and so on and so on. Well, that's how cults work. That's what a lot of cults do. And they'll name themselves Christian ministry, like the Alamo Christian Ministry, in order to make it sound like they're a Christian organization. And with some of the things that they do to people, there is no way Jesus teaches us to do some of the things that they do, but they just take it and twist it in their own little sick mind. So anyway, that's one of the reasons we're doing it, is because I just really feel like the Holy Spirit's telling me that's what he wants me to do. And we don't want, these cults to suck you into their delusions. We want you to understand exactly how they work. So we're going to be taking a wild ride. And before we get started, I want to give you a disclaimer. Due to this being a Christian channel, we're going to be refraining, or actually I'm doing this video, so I'm going to be refraining from giving out any types of like gruesome details. However, we are going to still be, or I'm still going to be talking about some details that could be triggering for some, such as sexual abuse to children, mental, emotional abuse, physical abuse, all of that. So if this is triggering to you, I really recommend you not listening to this video. Okay, and before we get started, I want to give credit to how I was able to gain all this information. The two cult leaders of the Alamo cult were Tony and Susan Alamo. Susan had a daughter named Christiane Cuie, C-U-I-E. It was not Tony's child, it was Susan's child. And she has a book out that is called Mama Said. And it's about a daughter's escape from the Alamo Christian Foundation cult. And she gives a lot of details on how things got started, how it went, that kind of thing. So it's a 36 chapter book, but I don't know, I recommend it if you can handle it. And the person, and then the lady, there's a lady named Summer Sanchez. She's not a Christian video, but she did do an excellent YouTube video on this cult. And so I was able to gain some information from her as well. So between that and just some searching and whatnot, is where I was able to get all this information. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the people that started this cult were actually on your TV or your parents' TV in the 1970s. Yep. Right, it was a right in your face cult. And we're talking about Susan and Tony Alamo, who ran this Christian ministry. And in addition to this, they opened up multiple businesses together. And again, just remember, just because someone calls it a Christian ministry does not mean it is true Christianity and that they teach the way Jesus taught and the way Jesus lived. And unfortunately, there are people out there that use Christian religion to become rich and powerful. And please rest assured, when I say this, God does not like this. Okay, this does not make him happy. But unfortunately, that's what they do. And it really gives a dirty name to Christianity. But unfortunately, you know, a lot of times by the time these cults really get known to people, they're already big and they've made tons of money. And so anyway, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tell you a little bit, and then I'm gonna go back into Susan's early life and Tony's early life and how they were raised and how they actually ended up together. And you know, because Tony and Susan Alamo, they were married, and after you hear what they did, you're going to realize they were a match made in not heaven. The Alamo cult ended up having thousands of followers, and these followers were not allowed to do anything without Tony or Susan's permission. Tony and Susan actually arranged marriages for their followers and instructed them on what they were allowed to wear and how many kids they could have. They controlled so much of their followers' lives that it was just like a domestic situation, but you get the idea. And you know, and remember, God gave us free will to make our own decisions and to come to him freely. He does not give others control over our free will. So they even controlled how their, you know, followers were allowed to think. Okay, so let's go back to, we're going to start with Susan, go back to Susan a little bit. And she was born in 1925 in Alamo, Arkansas, which at that time had a little less than 1,000 people. She was originally named Edith Opal Horn. However, she changed her name legally to Susan Fleetwood. Susan was born to Jewish parents, and from all appearances, she seemed to have a fairly normal childhood. Now, a lot of times when you have this kind of situation, they have a crazy upbringing, but she appeared to have had a pretty fairly normal childhood. Her father was in the military when she was young, but unfortunately, he contracted tuberculosis, and so he ended up being released early. When he came back home, he attempted to keep Susan away from him because he didn't want her to contract it. But she loved being with her dad. And so, unfortunately, so that did not happen. She did not contract TB, though, from him. But they ended up spending a lot of time together reading from the Bible. And Susan really hung on to the scripture from Matthew regarding having faith as small as a mustard seed, and believed that if she had enough faith, her father would be healed. Unfortunately, he did die from the TB. And even though her father passed away, she still continued to grow in her beliefs and even used to preach to her friends. And one of the things that she would do is she'd have all her friends sitting down, and if they tried to get up and leave, or if they talked, she'd smack them. And so they just ended up staying there and listening to her. And so one of the things you're going to learn through all this too is that Susan was extremely confident. And all the boys, plus many others, liked that about her. And as she grew older, she decided she wanted to be a singer or an actress and go to Hollywood. Her dream was one day to become famous. Unfortunately, Susan became pregnant by her boyfriend at the age of 15, and she ended up marrying the baby's father. They had a boy, and they named him Charlie. Well, shortly thereafter, she decided being married was not for her, and at the age of 16, she took her son Charlie and headed to California. Susan's dream of becoming a Hollywood star did not work out for her, so she got a job it's something called a B girl, B-E-E girl, which is a girl that stands at the bar looking beautiful, and she holds a glass of it's got either tea in it or apple juice, but it's designed to make it look like an alcoholic beverage. And the goal was, when a man walked in, he would see this beautiful woman and he would offer to buy her a drink, and then he would also buy himself one, not realizing that the drink she's drinking just has tea or apple juice in it. But that's what she did to make money. And when Susan was working one of her shifts, she met a man, and his name was Saul Lipowitz, Lippowitz. And when he walked in, he was immediately attracted to Susan, eventually becoming Susan's second husband. Saul was Jewish as well. And Saul's parents actually threw him out of the house when he was 6 years old for being a troublemaker. Can you imagine that? So with that said, Saul had to resort to stealing and ended up becoming a really tough guy. I mean, he had to take care of himself. When Saul was 10 years old, he messed with the wrong guys, and he was trying to be the tough guy, and he was aggravating them, and they were teenagers. And so they had enough of him, and they picked him up and they threw him in the freezing water. Problem was, Saul couldn't swim. So lucky for him, there was a man who was a local prize fighter, pulled Saul from the water and ended up taking Saul under his wing, teaching him to fight and taking care of him. That was probably the most stable time in Saul's life. And with all this training, Saul ended up becoming a prize fighter himself. Well, ultimately, Saul became a debt collector for the mafia. Which brought him from living. So when he became the debt collector for the mafia, he was sent from Philadelphia to Los Angeles, which is where he met Susan. Saul and Susan got married, and then they had one daughter. Her name was Susan Jane. And like Susan Jane later changed her name to Christian. I don't know how to pronounce that. It's Christiaon, but everyone called her Chris, so we're going to call her Chris. And at this point, Saul, Susan, Charlie, Susan's first child, and Chris were living together. And due to Saul's job, he was constantly being arrested. So he wasn't able to spend a whole lot of time with the family, causing Susan needing Susan to get a job again. She was constantly looking for food, and she was being evicted from her home all the time because she wasn't paying the bills. She was also sleeping with multiple men who she thought would help her get into the entertainment industry. Didn't work. Susan did discover, however, that her daughter Chris was very talented and she had a beautiful voice. And so Susan began to cash in on this, causing Chris to be put in positions that she was just not comfortable with. You know, Chris was not like Susan. Susan was outgoing. She could get anyone to do anything that she wanted. Chris, on the other hand, was shy, intimidated, introverted. And so she just wasn't comfortable with getting up in front of people and singing and doing the things that Susan wanted her to do. Unfortunately, her mother forced her to, so she didn't have a choice. And, since Susan was forced to fend for her and her children, she started doing cons. I don't know, maybe she didn't, this was probably around 1945, 46 by then. So maybe it was harder for her to get a job. I'm not sure, but instead of just getting a job, she decided to do cons, felt it was easier. Well, one of her cons was that she would get herself and Chris dressed up just really to the T's, and they would go to a church, and then while the church was ending, she would talk to the preacher, and she would put on the waterworks, and she would spill her guts about how her and Chris had just returned from a missionary trip to South America. Well, that wasn't true, of course. After hearing this, the preacher would allow Chris to sing, and both Susan and Chris would get up on the stage describing what they had been doing. So Susan talking, Chris singing. And Susan, she was great at giving a show and convincing people that what she was saying was true. I mean, she was just very good at manipulating people and very good at lying. And due to Susan's charm and Chris's voice, the people in the congregation were just amazed at their story and at Chris's voice. So an offering plate would be passed around. And, maybe at this time in Susan's life, she was just trying to make sure her children ate, had a roof over their head. Maybe this was the only way she knew how to do it, or the only way she could do it. I'm just kidding. It's not what she did. She took the money and treated herself to nice clothing and dinners out at nice restaurants. The children never saw any of this. And if they saw any, it was very little. And Chris goes on to say in her book that this con in the church really bothered her. But what choice did she have? Susan forced her to do it, so she had to do it. And Susan, she belittled Chris by constantly telling her she was worthless and that she was lucky she had Susan, or she would be burning in hell already. Yeah, she told her daughter this, and I think Chris at this point was about 8 years old. And that made me think of the verse, Matthew 18:6. But if you cause one of these little ones who trust in me to fall into sin, it would be better for you to have a large millstone tied around your neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. So during this time, Susan also abused Chris mentally, emotionally, and even physically. At this point in time, we don't know what happened with Charlie. Charlie's never mentioned again. We have no clue what happened to him. Did he go live with his father? We have no clue what happened. He's just not mentioned again. So just an FYI, that's why Charlie's name's not going to be brought up. During this time as well, Susan became a very, very heavy drinker, which intensified the abuse on Chris. So when Chris was, about 8 or 9 years old, Susan actually met a man named Vern Emerson. And right at this point, we are in the 1950s, early 50s. And Vern, he was in the entertainment industry, which is one of the major reasons Susan liked him. The problem was Vern was married, and not just was he married, but he was married to a Hispanic woman. And that made Susan very sick. And you'll find out that Susan is very racist. And Susan and Vern, they started out as friends. And Vern, he knew that Susan and Chris were struggling. So he invited them to family dinners often as a way for them to eat. And Chris, she said that she loved this time because they would go to Vern's house, and he had this beautiful house, and it was clean, and it was just like a real warm, fuzzy home. And she got to play with his children as well, and she loved it. Well, ultimately, Susan and Vern did begin to have an affair where Vern would come to their apartment often and take them to nice restaurants. And Chris loved that because she never got to go out to eat. And, during the time that Susan was seeing Vern, Susan was a lot nicer to Chris, and she really liked that. Unfortunately, this did not last though. And one day when Chris came home from school, her mother was sitting in the chair when she was crying, and she told Chris that Vern had dumped her. And then she proceeds to tell Chris that she's gonna kill her because it was her fault that they broke up. And so she went to Chris and she grabbed her neck and she started just shoving her head into the wall until Chris was bleeding from her head. And then she throws her on the floor and she starts kicking her over and over again. Well, thank God Chris was able to get away and she ran to the bathroom, which gave, I guess, Susan maybe a little time to calm down, but she does go to the kitchen and she gets a knife and comes into the bathroom where Chris is and looks at Chris and says, "Why do you make me do these things?" So Chris apologizes to Susan and tells her that she's sorry. She didn't mean to make her do that. And so Susan tells Chris, "You know what? You're just mentally ill. And if it wasn't for you, you'd be in a mental, if it wasn't for me, you would be in a mental institution or hell, whichever one came first." So you got your emotional abuse there. So unfortunately, this is the life of Susan so far, and this explains the kind of person she is. And the reason that I went back into this part of Susan's life and Chris's life is it's going to explain a lot to where it went, what happened later. I mean, she's a classic abuser, right? Yeah, I think so. Chris, after this incident, Chris did end up getting admitted to the hospital for her injuries. And she said in her book, she loved being in the hospital. She absolutely loved it because she got 3 meals a day and all the nurses were just so nice to her. And why this situation was never investigated by the police, I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me. I can only assume Susan was such a manipulator and such a good talker. She probably came up with this like wonderful story. Plus, we're talking about the 1950s. And, abuse just wasn't as recognized as it is today. But that is the only reason I can think that she was not charged. And, she's just a charmer. So we're going to now fast forward a few years to when Chris is 12 years old. Saul has gotten out of jail. He had just gotten out of another jail term for beating up people for the mafia. And he's back to working his mafia job doing debt collection. And when he does debt collection, this involves severe beatings. A lot of times mafia don't kill you because if they do, they're never going to get their money. But they'll beat you close to death, and that's what he would do. But what Saul did not know is this person that he beat up actually had connections to the Los Angeles Police Department. And after this happened, 4 of LAPD's finest, they actually retaliated on Saul with a baseball bat and almost killed him, came very close. And of course, Saul was admitted into the hospital. And at that point, Susan just told Chris not to worry about it. He was worth more to them dead than alive anyway, so don't worry about it. Well, Susan, in her conning ways, decided, once Saul came back home and he was resting on the couch and still healing from his injuries, Susan decided she was going to extort money from the LAPD, but this did not work. In fact, it did just the opposite. It put a huge mark on Susan, Saul, and Chris. I mean, what she did was she contacted the newspaper, and she was going to have this big spread put in the newspaper. And of course, LAPD found out, and that ended up putting them in some serious issues. So the 3, Chris, Susan, and Saul ended up running, and they ran to this remote location. I'm assuming Saul must have known about this, and it's where other people were hiding out as well, people that were hiding from the mafia, from the police, whatever. So kind of not a good group of people, but that's where they were hiding out. And the conditions were extremely bad, no electricity, no running water, that kind of thing. Well, they ended up staying there for about 6 months, and then Susan decided it was safe for them to return home. However, she told Saul at that point he would not be staying with her and Chris. She wasn't going to divorce them, but no longer wanted to be with him. So they returned home and went their separate ways, with Saul in his own place and Chris and Susan in their own place. So now we're going to move up to when Chris is 13 years old. And we're still telling a little bit more of this story because I want to show you how manipulative and psychologically abusive Susan is. Okay. So when Chris was 13 years old, she meets a 16-year-old boy, and they end up becoming boyfriend and girlfriend. They're going to the movies, they're holding hands, and they're just hanging out. And Chris was so happy with this boyfriend. His name was Robbie. He was always telling her how beautiful she was and how she looked so nice. And these are things she never heard from her mom. So she was really enjoying hearing these things. And she tried really hard to keep this relationship from her mom. She did not want Susan to know about this. One thing you'll find is Susan does not want anything good to happen to Chris. Unfortunately, Susan did find out. So she tells Chris she's a whore and just all kinds of nasty things, and that she wants to meet this boy. So when Chris went to Robbie and she told him about it, he was excited because he really did like Chris, and he was excited to meet her mom. And he was very into this relationship at this point as well. And now remember, this is the 50s, so a 13 and 16-year-old would be kind of common, and people married younger then. And so he came over to the house, and he was being very polite to Susan, and everything was going fine. But, you know, as you're figuring out with Susan, this isn't going to last. So Susan proceeds to ask Robbie what his plans for the future are. Well, he tells her his plans are to go to Stanford. It's expensive college. So Susan asked if his parents were rich or something, and he says, no, not really, but they've been saving for his college his whole life. Plus, he had been working in the summer on the summers, and he had saved up $1,500, and $1,500 is a lot now, but it was a ton back in the 50s. Well, as soon as Susan hears this, she begins flirting with this 16-year-old boy. She's mocking Chris in front of this 16-year-old boy, and her manipulation tactics worked. And eventually, Robbie, the boyfriend, starts doing the same thing, mocking Chris, calling her names, telling her she's worthless. Total opposite of what he'd been doing. Well, before the night's over, Chris is the third wheel at this point, and she's just kind of sitting there watching them two flirt back and forth. And Robbie gets ready to leave, and so Susan tells Robbie that he is welcome to come over anytime he wants, even if Chris wasn't there. Well, he did just that, and he started coming over all the time, but not for Chris, for Susan. And Susan and Robbie began having an affair, and Chris was out. Seems like that's statutory rape, but yes, that's what had happened. So once Susan was able to get all of Robbie's money, he was gone, out the door, never saw him again. This is her life, cons after cons after cons, using people for whatever she wants. So now we're going to fast forward to another year, which would make Chris probably about 14. And this is when Susan meets Tony Alamo. Susan and Chris, they were sitting in a bar, and they saw one of their friends walk in with Tony. Well, Chris knew who Tony was, and she knew he was a sleazy con artist and wanted nothing to do with him. She knew that he lied all the time and tried to make himself look like this great music producer when he was nothing but a con artist. Tony tried really hard to make himself look like he was more than he was. And Tony, he would tell anyone that would listen that he had actually helped make the Beatles and the Rolling Stones who they are. It's not true. He didn't help them at all. He dressed to the nines with these big, large glasses, trying to make himself look like this big-time producer, and he wasn't. Kind of sounds like Susan, doesn't it? Well, Tony, he was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in 1934, which made him 9 years younger than Susan. But at this point, we realize age doesn't really matter to Susan. And Tony's parents were also Jewish, and Tony was very well known to be a liar, a big liar, since he was a very young age. Tony actually went by multiple different aliases when he first moved to LA, and he ultimately landed on the name Tony Alamo. Any newcomer that came to Hollywood or to Los Angeles and wanting to get into the music industry because he was claiming to be this great music producer, he would get with them. He would give them these huge lies about who he was with and who he's helped, the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, all that. And they would believe him, and they're thinking, oh, yes, I'm getting with this great music producer, and he can help us. I mean, if he did that for the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, he can do that for me. And Tony had put this binder, like a notebook, together, and he used that as his portfolio, and he would show all these lying accomplishments to these inexperienced people coming to Hollywood. I mean, he was just a con artist because, of course, they would pay him money to get famous. And he had no contacts, no way to do it. So when Tony met Susan, he was actually married with children, but we really don't know a whole lot about his first wife or his children. In addition, though, to being married, Tony has a mistress on the side. And so at this point, though, he was living with his mistress named Julia. Now, we don't know, like I said, what happened to the wife and children. Maybe the wife has found out about the mistress and kicked him out. We really don't know, but he's living with his mistress, Julia. And Chris, she actually knew Julia, and she knew that she worked for a restaurant. And at this point, Julia is funding Tony's lifestyle with nice cars, clothes, everything. And unfortunately, this is when Susan notices Tony, and so she begins her flirting, and she sits and listens to Tony, she sits and talks to Tony. And Chris knows Tony is broke and living off his pregnant girlfriend. And she just sat there listening to Susan lying to Tony, Tony lying to Susan about how great they were. And she knew none of it was true. But I mean, she's 14 years old. So Tony gets up and he goes to the restroom. So while he's going, Chris tries to tell Susan, look, this is who Tony really is. All these things he's telling you is a lie. He's living with his pregnant girlfriend. He's got a wife. You know, she's supporting his lifestyle. He's not telling you the truth, because Chris had had multiple conversations with Julia. And so she knew this was not true. So when Tony came back to the table, instead of Susan listening to Chris, she tells Chris to shut up and to not come home that night. She just told Chris to go find a place to stay. Go, don't come home tonight. She's 14 years old in Los Angeles. And she tells her 14-year-old child not to come home. I mean, who does this? So anyway, as Chris is leaving, she actually hears Susan ask Tony if he knew Jesus was returning back very soon. And Tony says, well, yeah, I know that. How did you know? Susan then tells Tony that they should return to her apartment and pray about it. And remember this, pray about it, because it comes really symbolic in this story. So she has just sent her 14-year-old daughter, Chris, out into the night to fend for herself so that she can go home and pray with Tony. So anyway, Susan and Tony go home, go back to Susan's apartment, and they pray about Jesus returning to earth. And after this, they are inseparable. And the match made in heaven? No, not match made in heaven. But the relationship has formed. So Tony still has his girlfriend, that's pregnant, Julia. So he goes to her and says, hey, why don't you move in with us? Well, Julia doesn't realize at the time that they're actually boyfriend and girlfriend. And, she's pregnant. She's working in a restaurant. She's getting ready to deliver the baby. She's going to be out of work. So she's probably thinking financially, this would help her for a little while the baby was coming. She would have a place to go. And so now we have Susan, Tony, Chris, and Julia living under one roof. Still don't know where Charlie is. Well, Susan and Tony, during this time, they kept going behind the bedroom doors and having prayer. In the beginning, Julia kind of believed it, but after a day or two, she finally caught on they were not praying. And so after a couple of days, Julia says something about it. She confronts Tony, and Susan and Tony end up kicking Julie out, and she leaves. And it's believed that the reason that they did it this way was so that it did not look like Tony was leaving his pregnant girlfriend. She had left. I mean, he's got to keep up his reputation, right? I mean, he is this famous music producer. Ugh. I mean, honestly, I just can't with these two. So at this point, Susan and Tony finally end up getting divorced from their current spouses in 1966. And they are married in a quick wedding in Vegas. Now, I know I just fast forward, but I'm going to explain why. And while they went to Vegas, they just left Chris to fend for herself. Yeah, just left him to fend for herself. So anyway, now Tony has abandoned his wife and children and his pregnant mistress and soon-to-be child, and Susan's abandoned Chris, and she's also divorced Saul. Still don't know where Charlie is. I think he does come back up a bit towards the end. I don't know. But anyway, Susan actually did leave Chris with a friend of hers. She didn't fully abandon her, but she did leave her, but she left her with a friend of hers, and the friend's name was Tara. Now, Tara was an ex-sex worker, but she had really turned her life around, and she had cleaned up her act. And Tara, she was very caring, and this was a really good thing for Chris. It gave her stability and nurturing. And things that Susan, never gave her. But, unfortunately, Chris began to miss her mom, even though she was living in a better environment. So she ended up moving to Vegas to be with Susan. I mean, it was her mom. She wanted her mom to love her. And, we can understand this. So one thing I can ask everyone throughout this whole story is please do not victimize. Please do not, do not say bad things about the victims. Okay. If we don't walk in their shoes, we don't live their life, we have no idea why they make decisions, why they do things. And Chris is a victim. Okay. And we also don't have the right to judge anyone except Susan and Tony. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. So she ends up going back to Vegas to be with Susan. And oh man, Susan opened that door and she was not happy to see Chris. And she told her, fine, you can stay here, but you're going to get a job and you're going to help support us. So Chris started working odd jobs, including singing in casinos. But of course, she's forced to give all her money to Susan and Tony. Well, one day, Susan was in the bathroom. They're living in this little hotel room. Susan's in the bathroom and she's bleaching her hair. And Tony and Chris are just sitting out in the room watching TV or whatever. All of a sudden, Tony just jumps on Susan and he rapes her. Well, Susan didn't hear anything because she was in the bathroom bleaching her hair and had hair dryers and all that stuff going, so she didn't hear anything. But when all the screaming got louder, because Chris was screaming, she walks out of the bathroom and she's like, what is going on? And she, Chris is hysterically crying and Tony's frazzled. And Susan's like, what is going on? So Chris tells Susan what happens. And Tony says, no, she's psycho. And who do you think Susan believed? Well, of course, you'd be right. Tony, not her daughter, Tony. Mother of the Year, right? Mother of the Year award for sure. Not. So Chris is like, you know what, forget it. And so she leaves and returns to California to live with her father, Saul. And she stayed with him for a short while. And one of the things you'll learn through this is Saul really did love Chris. He loved his daughter, but Chris had this thing about wanting to please her mom. And it was just, it was an emotion. It was the emotional being beat down and the physical and the mental. And she just wanted to please her mom. And she knew she had her dad's approval. So anyway, so that's one of the reasons she will continue going back. But she did live with Saul for a short while. And during this time, Susan and Tony remained in Vegas, and they ended up conning some investors, and they made a bunch of money, and they returned back to California, and they purchased this really cute little house in Malibu. And Susan told Chris, hey, why don't you move back in with us? And I'm thinking it wasn't so much because Susan wanted Chris to live with her. She didn't want her to live with her ex-husband, Saul. And so Chris is like, yeah, I don't think so. I don't think so. Your husband, Tony, raped me. I'm not going to come back and live there. Somehow, though, and Susan, in her manipulative ways, she was able to convince Chris to come back to live with them. And it was kind of a sad situation. Saul, he really did love Chris, and he would have really helped her. And he was actually really upset when she moved back. And Chris at this point is 16 years old. And so she gets a job close by where she meets close by to where her Tony and Susan are living in Malibu. And she meets this guy named Harry Moxley. And he's like 23 to 24 years old. But he believes that Chris is close to his age because it's what Chris tells him, where she's really 16. Well, they begin to date Harry. Chris begins to date Harry, and they fall in love really fast. And then Chris finds out she's pregnant, and Harry wants her to have an abortion. Chris does not want an abortion, so this relationship ends. And she does end up having the baby, and it's a girl, and she names her Tiffany. And Chris, she was able to eventually get herself an apartment of her own for her and Tiffany to live in. She was really starting to get on with her life. And by this point, though, Tony and Susan, they had blown all the money they conned, and they lost their house in Malibu. So they're back to living in this crappy apartment. But Chris and her daughter Tiffany, they're doing pretty well. Nothing fancy, but they're doing pretty well. She's got a job. She's supporting them. Well, there's a neighbor that lives in another apartment close to Chris, and his name is Ed. And they began a relationship. And this relationship progressed pretty quickly. So they decided, Well, since we're just like living next door basically to each other, there's no sense in paying double the rent. Let's just move in together and we can save some money. And things are, pretty good there for a while, but then they ended up getting into an argument and Ed ends up leaving. They do patch up things and they realize that, we moved in together too soon. We shouldn't have rushed that. So they continue dating, and then Ed ends up moving into a house with some friends of his. Well, Susan finds out about Ed, and she tells Chris she wants her to bring him to their apartment, wants her and Tiffany and Ed to come to her crappy apartment with Tony so that she can meet Ed. Chris is like, oh gosh, no, not this again, not this again. So I think she's thinking, well, Susan's got Tony this time. Maybe she won't do this with my boyfriend, and she's just like, okay, we'll just come over there. We'll say hello and we'll leave. So she brings Ed over. And as soon as they walk in the door, Susan started telling Ed all about how Jesus was coming back soon. Well, when Chris heard this, she was ready to leave. But Susan's like, no, you guys stay. Well, Ed didn't want to be rude, so he said, okay, we'll stay for a little bit. And she started giving her sermon and telling him that God brought him to her that day because God wanted her to start a Christian army. She told Ed that God needed good, strong men to help fight in the war of Armageddon, which is a war that brings evil. And God needed them to fight this war. Yeah, because God needed Susan to do this, right? She told Ed that she was this great actress in California and that Tony was this huge music producer. But God had told them to give up all their worldly possessions and devote their lives to spreading his word. And that's why they, of course, lived in a crappy apartment, because they gave up everything. Well, Ed, he was mesmerized, and Chris was just like, I cannot believe this is happening. So after Susan gave her sermon, she had them all kneel and pray. And then she asked Ed, was there anyone else at his house? And he told her, well, there's a few people, and one is my roommate, Chuck. So Susan told Ed, hey, go back to your house, get Chuck, let's bring him over. So Chuck comes over, and she gives the sermon all over again. Chuck's mesmerized. So Ed and Chuck said, hey, Susan and Tony, why don't y'all come back to our house? We have people coming and going all day. And you can give your sermons and teach people what you're teaching us. And maybe they can join God's army so we can all fight this war of Armageddon. Now, there is going to be a war of Armageddon, but that's going to be Jesus and his saints fighting that war, not Susan and Tony. Well, if they had accepted Christ, and then, yeah, maybe. But anyway, I digress. And so after Ed and Chuck asked Susan and Tony to come back to this house, they did. They went back to his house. And Susan is, she has not a shy bone in her body. She don't mind. She'll say whatever. Yeah. So she walks in Ed and Chuck's house, and she looks at everyone in the house and says, this house is now a Christian house, and if anyone doesn't like it, they need to pack up and leave. So some people did leave, but many stayed. And she ended up preaching all night to all the people who were there about becoming God's army, part of God's army. Not about salvation, about becoming God's army on this earth. And of course, they don't like the government. So after this happened, Susan and Tony ended up returning to the house every single night. Now, they're still living in their crappy apartment, But they returned to this house every single night. And the neighbors started coming. They were hearing about all this. And so the neighbors were coming and people were bringing their friends. And so it's, starting to grow. And so at this point, Susan and Tony still have the apartment, but they're spending a lot of time at this house. And this house now is become known as the church. And the cult has begun. At this point, Susan and Tony, they started getting like flyers together, and things like that. And they started sending their followers out to colleges and just different places to give Susan's sermon about becoming part of God's army. And so the way that they would do it, though, is they would go out, and if they saw someone, they were just screaming at them, not just going up and talking to them nicely, starting a casual conversation, screaming at them. And every once in a while, they get someone that was interested. So they would be like, hey, come on to the house, let's talk about it. Let come hear Susan's sermon. And said they would. And this cult is really kicking off and starting to grow. And so I'm warning you at this part. This is the part where the cult has started. And there's going to be a lot more sexual abuse, physical abuse, so many more things. So this is another trigger warning. We're not going to go into details, but we will be mentioning it. So if it's a trigger, please skip the rest of the video or skip this video. We don't want anyone to get triggered. So this part's actually kind of funny when I'm fixing to tell you. It is and it isn't. But, Susan's a great talker. And she ain't got a shy bone in her body. She will do whatever. So she decided that she needed to save Elvis Presley's soul. Yes, King of Rock, Elvis. So she drives to his house with Tony. And she tells the guard that she needs to save Elvis's soul. And Elvis actually agrees to meet with her in his home. Now, it's said that Elvis thought this was really weird, but she got his attention enough with her passion. And so he gave her $5,000 for her cult. And as this cult grew, you will find more famous people get involved with Susan. Like, I think there was Dolly Parton, the Clintons, and some others. And so at this point, so now they've got the $5,000, and this is how they went to Vegas, got married, all that. Okay. So as the cult continued to grow, they decided that they would name this church cult Music Square Church. So at this point, it's called Music Square Church. And Susan, she was really starting to make a name for herself. And you remember, she wanted to be famous. And by this point, we're in the 1960s. And this is when the cult was setting up at the colleges and different workplaces to get people in. And Tony was helping a lot, but Susan was the main attraction and who people came to see. And by this point, they had 20, 30, 40 members. And so Susan and Tony started inviting their most dedicated members to live at this house, which is now the cult. So people were actually moving in and they were just sleeping on the floors, any place they could lay their head. The new recruits, anyone coming in, were instructed to be taught and trained on how to talk with people, which usually started with the yelling, and then tell them about Susan and her church and bring them to hear her. And of course, they called it a church, but we know it's a cult. And they were told that if they would come to the service, they would get a nice free meal to go with it. And by the way, these meals, Susan didn't go in the kitchen and cook these meals. No, she had her members go to dumpsters and pull out food and bring it back and set it up as their dinner. So, yeah, she's not going to spend no money. Well, in addition, she decided that she was going to tell her members that she has been diagnosed with terminal cancer. But through her faith, she's been healed. She didn't have cancer. Now, that bugs me. You know, if you know me, I'm a 7-time cancer survivor, and that bugs me when people do that. Well, all this bugs me, but that bugged me big time too. But she's healed, so no worries, right? Susan and the other thing is Susan and Tony, they absolutely hated Catholicism. And they bashed their beliefs daily. Every sermon has something to do with Catholicism. They hated it. And then Tony would go in and tell everyone how he converted to Christianity, since if you remember, he was from a Jewish family. Susan also went so far as to tell her people that the Catholics actually killed Abraham Lincoln and JFK. Well, after the sermons, she would have Chris sing. And Tony would then tell everyone how he converted to Christianity and how all that happened since he was Jewish. And then he would also tell everyone how he used to have major bodyguards and things like that because he was this huge music producer, but he gave it all up for God. And he also went on to say that God had come to him and told him he was a prophet and needed to get the word out that Jesus was coming and the end was near. Y'all remember, Tony's a con man and a fraud. He used people, he lied, and he was never a famous music producer. So it's not possible that God told him to give up this life when he never actually had it. And I guess he forgot to mention to the followers and the members that he had raped Chris while he was this supposed prophet. Do you really think that Susan and Tony started this to save people from their sins and bring them to Jesus Christ? Or was it for money? They might have actually believed in Jesus Christ, but they did not know Jesus Christ. And Susan and Tony, they really focused hard on the homeless, especially if they were receiving welfare checks. Can you guess why? They then had these homeless people who eventually some would move into the house, and they would have them sign their checks, their welfare checks, over to them. And even people that had jobs were eventually signing their checks over to Susan and Tony. And so, because, you know, Susan and Tony, they had convinced these people that they had a higher calling from God and they needed to hand over all worldly possessions to the church, aka Susan and Tony. Well, you know, that house was pretty small, so the colt begins to grow out of the house, and the neighbors are calling LAPD regarding the noise and traffic and everything they were causing. The members were actually standing in the street yelling at anyone that tried to drive by. So in the beginning, Susan was able to talk her way out of everything. And after a while, she wasn't able to talk her way out with the LAPD. And so what they started doing is they would show up every time it was service time, and then they would shut it down and send everybody home. So she wasn't able to give her sermons. So this is when Tony and Susan decided, okay, it's time to get out of this little house. Let's go to West Side Hollywood. And they found a 2-story home, much bigger, and they could house actually more people, thus taking people's checks. And this area was actually a lot more populated. There was a lot of restaurants, businesses, homes, and so much more. So this was a perfect place to build their cult because they could go out there and minister. You know, don't you love my quotes? They could go out there and minister to more people and bring them in, you know, to save their souls and to join God's army. And so what they did was they were like, well, yeah, let's file paperwork and we're going to become an official church. And it became then known as the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation. And what does this mean when you have a church? Well, no taxes. So anything they were making, they didn't have to pay taxes. It's a bargain, right? And this is also at the time when Susan and Tony became much more strict with their members. The members, they were not allowed to flirt with anyone. They were not allowed to flirt with each other. They were not allowed to have relationships without Susan or Tony's permission. Let's see, you were not allowed to criticize the foundation or the Alamos, nor could you ask any questions in regards to what the Alamos said or did. You were not allowed to question. You know, Jesus always tells us, test the spirits, always check. Like we always tell y'all, go behind us, make sure what we're telling you is accurate. You know, use your discerned spirit. Well, they were told, can't do that. And if you hid money, you were told that you were demon possessed and you got kicked out. And then what they started doing too is their loyal followers, they would start giving them positions, almost like a kind of like a military, you know, a sergeant, a captain, and all these different things. And they started giving these loyal followers these positions. And these followers that were getting these positions, what they had to do was they had to watch the other members and make sure they were following in line. And if they didn't, and they were called the overseers, and if they didn't, these members did not follow in line, they were to report back to Susan and Tony. And they also started two different types of lists. One was a report list, and the other was Ask Tony list. And the report list is exactly what it sounds. Report anything to the Alamos of any member not following the rules. And the Ask Tony list was the list of questions that the members would ask Tony when they wanted to do anything and they needed his permission. And this could be anything from having lunch with a friend, calling their friends or family, or even taking their child to the doctor. And Tony would then take these requests to Susan, who made the decisions. So Tony was just kind of like a puppet. And at this point, so during this time, Chris and Ed, they're still together and they're still living with Tiffany. But Susan at this point decides that she doesn't like her daughter Chris living together and not being married. So she started really pressing them about getting married. Well, Chris, I mean, she really loves Ed and she wants to get married, but she sees that he is falling farther and farther into this cult. And she knows this cult is nothing but a lie. And so this is concerning to her because she can't get Ed not to keep falling for this cult, but, you know, she don't want to be put on the report list either. So Chris decided she was going to test Ed's loyalty. And she's like, okay, look, I really do love you, Ed, and I want to marry you. But if that happens, we have to leave the cult, or they were calling it church, but we have to leave the cult. And, you know, he was a little upset at first because he really had developed his relationship with God, but he loved Chris enough that he said he agreed that he would leave with her. And so he then asked her to marry him, and she says yes. And they end up having a small wedding. And Chris, I mean, she was really excited. She had her nice, pretty dress. Her mom was going to do the ceremony. And she was, you know, getting just really excited to marry Ed. She knew they were going to be leaving the cult. But yeah, Susan didn't let that happen. No. So what she ended up doing right before the marriage, right for the wedding, she told Chris that Tony would be marrying them. Now, this is the happiest day of Chris's life at this point. She has a man that really loves her. They're leaving this place. And her mother has the man that raped her marry her. And, you know, Chris did what she did. She did what Mama said, and the wedding went forward. And soon after, Ed and Chris have one child together, and it's a daughter, and they name her Sarah. Unfortunately, because they didn't leave the cult, By the time Sarah was born, Chris's and Ed's relationship, it just started deteriorating. And Ed, he was just becoming so brainwashed that it got to the point Chris could not even stand to look at Ed any longer. She was just disgusted with how brainwashed he was. And also during this time, Chris's father, Saul, he was actually killed in a car accident, and Chris had to go and identify his body. And she was just incredibly distraught over this. And when she got home, she was just really upset, and she just wanted to lay down in bed, and she wanted her husband, Ed, just to hold her and let her sob and, and get through this. And of course, Ed had other ideas. And she's like, "Are you serious?" And he's like, "Well, you have to perform your wifely duties," which is what Susan taught. And she decides at that moment that her and her children were leaving. She's leaving Ed and she's leaving the cult. But she made the mistake of telling Susan she's leaving. Big mistake. All right. So at this point, this is where we're going to stop on part 1. And we will pick up again on part 2, because this is when Chris actually decides to leave the cult and what happens to Chris when she does this. It's rough. I'm gonna forewarn you, it's rough. And then it goes on, and then we're going to go on and talk about how the cult ended up moving on a compound and the things that happened. It's pretty rough, but I appreciate you guys sticking with me. And again, I'll record the rest of this later. And you guys have a great day. Thank you.